Tonight, the furnace has gone still, and 5 hand-blown pieces rest in the warm glow of the annealer. There had been a time, earlier in the day, when the studio was bright with heat. The furnace had glowed so intensely that looking at it directly was not possible. The air near the center of the room had rippled and shimmered, and everything within reaching distance of the main bench had been warm to the touch. Tools, countertops, the wooden handles of the jacks and tweezers, even the floor tiles nearest the furnace mouth, had carried a heat that could be felt through the soles of thick shoes. But that was hours ago. Now, the furnace had been closed down for the evening, its door sealed, its breath held. The room was cooling in the slow, deliberate way that glass studios always cool, from the edges inward, like a pond freezing in reverse. The walls cooled first, then the far corners, then the workbenches. The floor near the furnace would be the last to release its warmth, and even by morning, it would still carry a faint reminder of the day. The annealer was the one thing still running. It sat against the far wall, a box of steel and brick, its temperature falling in a curve so gradual that no single moment of change could be detected. Inside it, the pieces made during the day rested on a flat shelf, each one placed with space between them so the air could move evenly around their forms. There were 5 pieces tonight. 2 bowls, wide and shallow, their rims slightly uneven in the way that hand-blown glass always is. A tall vessel with a narrow neck, its surface carrying a spiral of darker color that wound from base to lip. A small round form, no larger than a fist, that had been shaped as an experiment and kept because its weight felt right in the hand. And one piece that was still unnamed, a shape somewhere between a vase and a pitcher, with a gentle curve at the top that might have been intentional or might have come from the way the glass had moved on its own in the final moments of shaping. These pieces would remain in the annealer through the night. By morning, they would have cooled to room temperature, their internal stresses resolved, their structures settled into the quiet permanence that glass finds when it is treated with patience. If they were removed too soon, they would crack. Not immediately, but sometime later. A day or a week, without warning, a sharp line would appear across the surface, and the piece would be lost. The glassblower had learned this, not from instruction, but from the particular sound that a cracked piece makes when it finally gives way. A soft, definitive tick. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small sound of something that could not hold together any longer. It was a sound that taught patience more effectively than any lesson. The studio had a high ceiling, open to the rafters, where the heat of the day collected and lingered, even now. The beams were darkened with soot in places, and a few old hooks hung from the crosspieces, holding nothing, remnants of some earlier arrangement that had been changed long ago. The windows were set high in the walls, above head height, designed to let light in but to keep the interior temperature stable. Most of them were propped open, and the evening air entered through them in slow currents, mixing with the warm air of the studio and creating a layered atmosphere that smelled of metal and mineral and the particular clean scent of heated sand. 'Cause that was what glass was at its foundation. Soda ash, limestone, sometimes a trace of metal oxide to bring color, but mostly sand, heated to a temperature so extreme that it lost its granular nature entirely and became something new, something that could flow and stretch and hold light inside itself and cool into shapes that felt nothing like the beach or the riverbed where the sand had been gathered. This transformation was the quiet center of the work. Not the shaping, not the blowing, not the tools or the techniques, but the simple fact that one substance could become another, that something ordinary could be changed through heat and patience into something that caught the light of a window and held it. The glassblower was sitting now on a stool near the main bench. The stool had a padded seat that had been replaced twice, the fabric stained in places from the iron oxide used in some of the coloring work. The bench itself was a long, flat surface of fire brick and steel, scarred with burn marks and scratches, and along its edge, a row of tools rested in a wooden rack. Jacks, tweezers, a diamond shears, several blowpipes of different lengths, and the pontil rods, their tips blackened from repeated heating and cooling. The tools were not cleaned at the end of each day. They were cleaned at the start of the next. This was a small tradition, a way of letting the day end without fuss, of leaving the studio in the state of its work, rather than erasing the evidence of it. In the morning, each tool would be wiped with an oiled cloth, inspected, and returned to its place. But for now, they rested where they had been set down, carrying the marks of the day on their surfaces. The glassblower looked toward the annealer. Its surface was warm to the touch, and a faint orange glow was visible through the small window in its door. Through that window, the 5 pieces could be seen, motionless, held in the amber light of the slowly decreasing heat. They looked different in there than they would look in the morning. The annealer light gave them a depth that natural light could not, a sense of being still in process, still becoming. In the morning, removed and set on a table in the daylight, they would look finished, solid, but in the annealer, in the fading glow, they still carried a quality of softness, as though the glass remembered being liquid and had not entirely accepted its new stillness. This was not true, of course. Glass did not remember. But the eye saw what the eye saw, and in the warm light of the annealer, the pieces looked as though they were dreaming of the shapes they might have become if the hands had moved differently, if the breath had been longer or shorter, if the glass had been gathered from a different part of the furnace. Along the windowsill, a row of small glass samples sat in a line. These were test pieces, made at the start of each new batch of color, each one no larger than a marble. They had been pressed flat while still hot and allowed to cool on the sill, and now they sat there like a palette rendered in glass. A deep cobalt, a transparent amber that looked almost like honey held up to the sun, a milky white that had been achieved by adding a particular mineral to the molten batch, a green so pale it was barely distinguishable from clear, and one piece that had gone wrong, its color muddied and uneven, the result of an experiment that had not produced what was intended, but had produced something else, something that the glassblower had kept because its imperfection was interesting. These samples caught what little light remained in the studio and held it in their small, dense bodies. Glass had this quality. Even in near darkness, it found light and did something with it. Bent it, softened it, changed its color, passed it through to the surface beneath. A piece of glass in a dark room was never entirely dark. It always carried something, some faint glow or reflection, some trace of the light that had once passed through it, as though the material had a memory of brightness that it could not entirely release. The shelves along the back wall held the raw materials of the work. Bags of silica sand, fine and white, heavier than they appeared. Smaller containers of soda ash and limestone, measured carefully for each batch. Jars of metal oxides for color, their labels handwritten. Cobalt for blue, iron for green, manganese for purple, cadmium for the deep reds and oranges that required the highest temperatures and the most precise timing. There was a notebook on the shelf beside the jars, its pages thick with notes. Batch numbers, temperatures, timing, results. Some pages had small sketches, quick drawings of shapes the glassblower wanted to try. Others had nothing but numbers, columns of temperatures recorded at 15-minute intervals during a particularly important melt. The notebook was not open tonight. It sat on the shelf, its cover slightly curled from the heat of the studio, its pages carrying the accumulated knowledge of many months of work. Tomorrow it would be opened, consulted, added to. Tonight it was simply another resting object in a room full of resting objects, each one holding its place in the quiet order of the workspace. The studio was emptying of its daytime character. The high energy of the work, the quick decisions, the coordination of hand and breath and heat, all of that had drained away with the daylight. What remained was the room itself. The massive furnace, now silent, its exterior still faintly warm. The marver table, a slab of polished steel that had been used to roll and shape the molten gathers, its surface still carrying the ghost of a handprint in condensation that had already almost evaporated. The bucket of water near the bench, still half full, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the ceiling in miniature. The floor was dusted with fine glass particles, too small to see individually but visible, in aggregate as a faint sparkle when the overhead light caught them at the right angle. These would be swept in the morning. For now, they were part of the studio, part of the day that had been, part of the work that glass required. Because glass was never entirely clean. It left traces of itself everywhere. On the tools, on the floor, in the air. A glassblower could shower and change clothes and still find, hours later, a tiny fleck of glass on the back of a hand or in the fold of an ear. These fragments were not sharp or dangerous in such small quantities. They were simply present, a reminder that the material had a persistence that outlasted the working session. The blowpipes hung on their rack in order of length, the shortest at the left, the longest at the right. Each one was a hollow steel tube, perhaps 4 feet long at the shortest and 6 at the longest, with a slight flare at the gathering end where the molten glass was collected. The mouthpiece end was wrapped in a layer of heat-resistant tape that had been replaced many times, each new wrapping slightly different in color from the last, so that the handles told a quiet history of use. The longest pipe had been used today for the tall vessel with the spiral of color. A long pipe allowed for a deeper gather, more glass on the end, which meant more material to work with, more time before the piece cooled beyond the point of shaping. But it also meant more weight at the end of the arm. More rotation needed to keep the molten glass centered, more physical demand on the shoulder and the wrist. By the end of a session with the longest pipe, the arms carried a pleasant heaviness, the kind of tiredness that comes from sustained, careful effort rather than from strain. Near the base of the pipe rack, a pair of thick leather gloves lay where they had been dropped at the end of the working day. They were stiff and creased, shaped by the hands that wore them, and they smelled of heat and iron. One glove had a small burn mark on the thumb, a dark spot where a drop of molten glass had landed during a moment of inattention weeks ago. The mark was smooth now, polished by continued use, a small scar that the glove wore without complaint. The overhead light was turned off. The studio went dark, except for the glow of the annealer and a thin line of streetlight that entered through the highest window. In this near darkness, the room changed again. The furnace became a large shadow. The workbench became a low horizontal line. The tools in their rack became a row of thin silhouettes. And the annealer against the far wall became the warmest, brightest thing in the room, a small rectangle of orange light that pulsed with a heat so controlled and gradual that it seemed less like fire and more like a held breath. The glassblower remained on the stool for a while, not working, not planning, not thinking about tomorrow or the pieces inside the annealer. Just sitting in the warm, darkening room, in the smell of heated sand and cooling metal, in the quiet company of the things that had been made and the tools that had made them. There was a satisfaction in this that had nothing to do with the quality of the pieces. It was simpler than that. It was the satisfaction of a room that had been used fully and was now resting, of hands that had worked steadily and were now still, of heat that had served its purpose and was now slowly, quietly letting go. The temperature inside the annealer dropped another degree. The pieces inside did not move. The glass was solid now, had been solid for hours, but the internal structure was still settling, still finding its equilibrium. At the molecular level, tiny adjustments were being made that no eye could see and no instrument in this room could measure. The glass was arranging itself, releasing the small tensions that rapid cooling would have locked in, finding the configuration that would allow it to last. This process would continue through the night. By dawn, when the annealer reached room temperature and its heating element clicked off for the final time, the glass would be as stable as it would ever be, ready to hold water, ready to sit on a shelf in the light, ready to last for decades or centuries, longer than the hands that shaped it, longer than the furnace that melted it, longer than the building that housed them both. Glass was patient that way. It asked only for one night of careful cooling, and in return, it offered a kind of permanence that few other materials could match. The glassblower stood and moved toward the door. The stool rocked slightly on the uneven floor, then settled. The door opened, and the cooler air of the outside entered the room in a single quiet wave, mixing with the studio warmth. The stars were visible outside, clear and still, as they always were on cloudless evening. The street was empty. A single light burned in a window across the way, behind a curtain that softened it to a faint yellow. The door was closed, but not locked. Studios in this part of the road were rarely locked. There was nothing inside that anyone would want to take except the glass. And the glass was in the annealer, and the annealer would not open until morning. So the room sat with its one glowing box of light, its slowly cooling furnace, its dusted floor and resting tools, and outside the night continued in its unhurried way, and the stars turned without sound, and the glass went on with its patient, invisible settling, degree by degree, moment by moment by moment. Through the long, quiet hours, the temperature dropped another degree, and another. The pieces inside held their shapes. The bowls, the tall vessel, the small round form, the unnamed shape with its gentle curve, each one finding its own stillness, each one becoming, in the slow warmth of the cooling oven, exactly what it was meant to be. And the night went on, steady and warm, and the studio held its breath, and the glass held its light, and nothing more was needed.